If you want to put in the chat where you're logging in from, it's always fun to see where people are located.
Mm-hmm.
I live here in southern Maine. Oh, Derry, New Hampshire.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Portsmouth, welcome. Okay. From New Jersey, welcome from New Jersey. Right. Well, we are very, very excited to have special guests tonight, Shaun Ziegenfusz and Kate Radville, talking to us about developmental language disorder. And super glad you could join us tonight for our Read for Parents. Oops, here's somebody from Ohio. So my name is Susan Horahan. I'm the current president of the International Dyslexia Association, Northern New England Alliance branch. We serve Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And we also have Chris with us tonight. I'll let Chris introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Chris Riley. I am the Vice President of the International Dyslexia Association, our Northern New England Alliance. And we want to say thank you so much to Shaun Ziegenfusz and Katharine Radville for hosting and being part of our conversation about developmental language disorder. Thank you.
Okay, just a few housekeeping pieces of information. Chris will be monitoring the chat and providing valuable links to our discussion topics. And we invite you to add your questions into the chat, and we'll have questions and answers at the end. So just go ahead and type them right into the chat. And we'll try to allow about 20 minutes at the end, and Chris will facilitate that. Please note that we do not issue certificates of attendance for this Read for Parents session or in some of our other IDA events, but some we do, but this one we are not offering CEUs. And the video and resources will be posted on the IDA-NNEA website within 1 week. We always get questions from people that are unable to attend the event live, but rest assured that they will be posted within about a week to our website. You can check it out there. We hope you'll consider becoming members. Some of the benefits for being an IDA member is a chance to connect with your community. You can get some great deals on conferences and stay informed, up to date with journals and magazines, expand your network and connect with your community. So there's a lot of good reasons to be an IDA member. And as far as the membership goes, as you can see here, there's about 7 different categories of memberships. So you can pick which one suits you and your needs the most. So they have some different prices, but they all offer some pretty amazing benefits. Check those out and pick the one that's right for you. Some of the things that we do each year is we do these Read for Parents 6 times a year. We have a collaboration with Wilson once or sometimes twice a year. We had our annual conference in October, and we'll be having another annual conference coming up in 2024. We have newsletters that go out February, December, and often we have additional newsletters that go out in between. And we do offer scholarships to some of our conferences. So with that being said, it's with great pleasure that I introduce our first I'll do Shaun Ziegenfusz. He's the CEO, and co-founder of the DLD Project, which is an impact-focused, innovative social enterprise founded to elevate awareness and understanding of DLD in Australia. Extensive and evolving research tells us what works best for people with DLD, but unfortunately, these learnings and insights sit in the hands of only a few. The DLD Project overcomes these roadblocks by providing an online platform that distributes evidence-based information, resources, and training created by contributors from around the globe. In addition to offering loads of free and paid tools and resources to support the Australian DLD community, a portion of the proceeds goes to funding game-changing DLD advocacy and research initiatives. Welcome, Shaun. And I will also introduce Katharine Radville. She's a doctoral research fellow in the speech language or SAIL literacy lab at the Massachusetts General Hospital Institute of Health Professions in Boston, under the mentorship of Dr. Tiffany Hogan. She is also an adjunct instructor in the Department of Communication Sciences. Kate is a speech language pathologist and literacy specialist with expertise in working with children with oral and written language difficulties, including developmental language disorder, or DLD, and dyslexia. Prior to her career as a speech language pathologist, she studied and worked in the field of early childhood education with a strong interest in early literacy, including as a classroom teacher. Kate's research interests include the implementation of evidence-based practices to support school-age children in the areas of oral language and literacy, and supporting families of children with DLD and dyslexia. So thank you both for being here tonight. I'm looking forward to what you have to share with us.
Our pleasure. Now, is this the time, Chris, where I would share the slides?
That'd be perfect.
I can do that. Now, can I just get a thumbs up that you can see that now? Awesome. Well, Kate and I have very much enjoyed putting this together, haven't we, Kate? We've got it.
Been a delight.
I got approached by Chris a while ago now to come along, and I said immediately, you know, I'm coming to you from an Australian context, whilst also having very much an international focus in the work that I do with raising awareness of developmental language disorder. But, you know, Kate has been able to work beautifully in all of the US sort of contextual information that we're going to really need to make tonight a really enjoyable experience. It's actually 10 o'clock in the morning for me, so this has worked out perfectly from a time perspective. And it's going to be quite, I guess, conversational, isn't it, Kate? We're going to sort of chat
Absolutely.
as we go. Yeah, so feel free to pop questions in the chat box, and we'll try and address those during that Q&A at the end. We're very ambitious. We've got quite a number of slides, so we might jump in and see how many we get through. Hey, Kate.
Yes, sounds perfect.
Before we begin, it's very customary in Australia that we acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet and work. In Australia, we were impacted by colonisation more than 200 years ago now, which really disrupted our relationship with First Peoples here in our country. So I want to acknowledge the elders of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, both past and present, as well as acknowledge the fact that I am working on the lands of the Turrbal and Yugara people, and I pay my respects to their elders especially. And it's really important that we also acknowledge that when thinking about talking about language as we do today, that language can mean lots of things to lots of different people. So I speak standard Australian English, but there's lots of different dialects and lots of different languages around the world. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about how speaking multiple languages might impact on the way in which we think about diagnostics a little bit down the track in today's webinar. I feel like Susan's done a wonderful introduction, Kate. I don't think we need to continue.
It was wonderful. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, it was a beautiful
Lovely
introduction. But it's really, I think, key to acknowledge that we've got a number of affiliations. In addition to being the co-CEO and co-founder of the DLD project, I'm also a lecturer at Griffith University. Kate, I don't know if you want to talk about NGH and your work there.
And in addition to being a member of the SAIL Literacy Lab, where I'm training currently as a doctoral research fellow under Dr. Tiffany Hogan, I'm an adjunct instructor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at the MGH Institute of Health Professions. So I've also been involved for many years training speech language pathologists, and especially training them to teach literacy.
And I think probably quite uniquely, we're both dual qualified teachers and speech pathologists, which is
yes, which I would strongly say, unfortunately, is not the case for many.
Yeah. So we very much come tonight with our hat of working in schools primarily, really passionate about DLD and dyslexia and the work that teachers and speech language pathologists will be doing in this space. So I am going to just quickly talk you through our sort of agenda for today, and then I'm going to hand over to Kate, who's going to jump into talking about language, knowledge, and reading. We've kind of identified 5 main areas that we'd really love to talk to you about this evening. The first one being around language, knowledge, and reading, knowing that, of course, that IDA is a dyslexia-based, focus organization, probably thinking, well, how does DLD fit into this? We really wanted to address that first and foremost. And then what we're going to look at is then the understanding of reading difficulties and the subgroups within that and how DLD and dyslexia will intersect. I'm going to jump in then and talk about DLD more specifically and what it means and the impact for DLD within schools particularly. And then we'll both talk a little bit about DLD advocacy, and I'll jump back in at the end about some very specific strategies about supporting children with DLD. Now, some of you may be parents of children with DLD or working with people with DLD, or this might be new information. So hopefully there'll be a little bit of something for everyone. So Kate, I'll hand over to you and you just give me a nod when you're ready for the next slide. How does that sound?
Fantastic. I know I need some subtle signals. So yeah, thank you for controlling
just nod
the
and
slides.
smile. Yeah,
perfect. And feel free to jump in if you want to expand on anything I say. Just jump right in. So we'll start with defining reading. So what's reading? Who's reading? Everyone here is arguably in some sense of the big picture meaning of the word reading, right? Everyone here is engaging with text, and I love giving the example of, earlier today I was reading a research article, and later today, full disclosure, I'm going to go home and I'm going to read Us Weekly, and all of that is reading, right? At 10 o'clock at night, I'm not actually even sure my brain will be able to handle Us Weekly, but I would argue that the research paper that I scoured earlier and the magazine that I plan to read while falling asleep actively at 10 o'clock after this talk, after I finish up at work, that's all reading. Who is reading? Perhaps on the far left. I'm not sure this young child is actually quite reading yet, but for the purposes of this talk, we're going to define reading as reading comprehension, being the end goal of reading, right? We can read words accurately, but not comprehend what we're reading. And whether we're reading for pleasure or reading to scour a research article, we need to understand something. Reading's not enjoyable if we gather no meaning from it. So arguably lots of different people are reading with lots of different purposes, but we're going to use the word reading this evening the same way as we would use reading comprehension, understanding what written words on a page mean. Click forward.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. I'm guessing that a lot of this audience is familiar with the simple view of reading, and this is not new, but it holds up. So this is straight out of, like many other great things, straight out of the 80s, right? And I used to joke with my students that I was getting the simple view, and actually we have 90 here, but this was before that even. Simple view reading conceptualized many years ago, and I've joked with my students over many years that I'm getting this as a tattoo, and I still might, because it's such a strong and powerful model for thinking about how we successfully read. On the left-hand side, we need word recognition. We need to read the words accurately. And those of us who are familiar with dyslexia know that when we have trouble reading words, as in dyslexia, reading is very difficult, right? We don't comprehend. We also know that we need to understand meaning and language. We need listening comprehension. And today we're going to largely focus on children with developmental language disorder, for whom the right-hand side of this equation is challenging. You'll often see this as multiplication, so word recognition times listening comprehension equals reading comprehension. And I like to emphasize that it's multiplication for a reason, right? If either side is 0, the product is 0. Comprehension breaks down. So this is just, this framework can really support how we think about reading and the end goal of reading, and how we think about children with dyslexia or DLD or both. We also know that listening comprehension isn't that simple, right? So we always have we have the simple view and then we make it more complicated. Listening comprehension involves vocabulary. Maybe that's the most straightforward piece, right? We have to know what words mean. If we don't know what a word means, we're probably not going to understand it. If we don't know what a word means when we see it when we're reading, even if we read it accurately, that happens sometimes, it's not going to really work in terms of comprehension, that end goal. We also know that we need background knowledge, right? We need understanding of the context, the world around us. Think about how hard it is to comprehend something you read when you know literally nothing about the topic. So if I wake up tomorrow and I say, oh, I think I'll read a physics textbook or even a physics research article, right? I don't have the prerequisite background knowledge to access that, no matter how strong my knowledge of some individual words and my accurate word reading are. Okay, I'm gonna see, I can see the chat. Let's try to use the chat for this actually. So we'll get the audience a little bit involved. So if you have seen this, you have to, I can't see the audience, but usually I'm like, do not respond if you've seen this passage. So please read this, okay? And then I'm gonna give you a reading comprehension quiz after. Low stakes, but I would love some involvement. Obviously, you don't have to type in the chat, but I'm gonna ask you a couple questions after. And I'll give you a couple minutes to read this passage. I think I have to ask Shaun too, don't advance the slide. I think the next one might give the answer away, right? Okay. So my first question is, could somebody please tell me exactly what this, actually we'll phrase it this way, we often do this in classrooms, right? Please write a title for this paragraph that's very clear in terms of letting the reader know about the topic. I did this last week during a talk and people actually were like right on it. I was really impressed. It was the first time in years I've had anyone, okay. Let a few people respond. I will say you're correct. I'm going to give another way. So this is in fact about doing laundry. And if we had about the washing machine, Julie's thinking the same, doing laundry. Yeah, okay. So this is a passage about doing laundry. Arguably, it's not incredibly clear. And we could probably think of other topics it could maybe be about. And if you advance a slide, I'll help you all out a little bit. Okay, so I've given you some specific vocabulary now. So go back for 1 second, Shaun. So if you're reading this and you don't have vocabulary knowledge, right? We have things, next step, things again. It's fairly vague, right? I'm not giving you a tremendous amount of specific vocabulary. You can go forward again. Okay, now we have clothes, we have piles, we have a washer and dryer, wash, we have specific vocabulary. And I've told you, I've given you some background knowledge that this is about doing laundry. And I'm guessing that whether you like it or not, nearly everyone here is somewhat familiar with doing laundry, my least favorite chore, but it's a familiar routine, right? So you have some background knowledge. And if I give you enough background knowledge, arguably, even though this group is fabulous, that's like 2 in a row who are like, oh yeah, it's about doing laundry. I would argue your reading comprehension is much, much better with specific vocabulary, right? And a child with DLD, vocabulary might be difficult, right? Imagine not having the specific vocabulary knowledge if that's challenging, and background knowledge. Okay, we'll do another one, I think. Okay. This time I've even given you pictures, but honestly, I only put them in for fun. But now read this one. I have another passage, one more exercise in reading comprehension. Then I'll ask a couple of questions. few seconds and then advance forward. I also want to acknowledge I am assuming that we're all reading the words accurately. So I am making that assumption. Okay,
Sorry,
go ahead.
you see, move forward.
What?
You want me to move forward?
Yeah, move forward. You're good. Thank you. Okay, question 1. These are a little more specific. Weird Sally put the Gophers. If anyone would like to throw that in the chat, we'd be grateful.
Mm-hmm. It's nice when people
Exactly.
participate.
Right?
Makes us feel
It's
less
late in the
lonely,
day
hey?
for, well, it's your morning. Like, we'll keep
I feel
this-
fresh and I've just finished my coffee, so I'm great.
Oh, I'm actually a morning person. So it's like, I had coffee very late in the day.
Mm-hmm.
Weird Sally put the Gophers. We need a very specific answer. If no one answers, I'm moving on. I'm gonna just take that as we're not really sure where Sally put the Gophers.
Mm-hmm. Lack of comprehension.
Lack of comprehension. I can take that as
Yeah.
oh, she
Oh,
let
here
them
we go.
loose. Okay. I give points for participation, but it's kind of non-specific in a backyard. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll go on to the next one. Where'd she want, why did she want guests to bring their motorcycles? Be as specific as possible. You can also throw in what the ad said. We'll do the second too. Nothing terribly specific so far. The party for some reason. Great. We don't know. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, you can go on to the next one.
Sure can.
It's a setup. Okay. So I only, in this case, you had all the vocabulary, right? The vocabulary was fairly specific, right? I assume some background knowledge that you perhaps know what a gopher was. I also acknowledge my picture of a gopher. I have no background knowledge. It could be a squirrel or something else, but we're assuming that. But okay, this passage is called Getting Rid of Bad Neighbors. Okay, so I'm going to give you only that's actually only a handful of words, right? But I'm going to give you that small little amount of background knowledge, and then Shaun, go backwards a slide, if you don't mind.
Oops, there we go.
Okay, now Weird Sally put the Gophers. Yeah, fabulous. Now we can be specific. Neighbor's yard, that's way better than let them loose. Why'd you want the guests to bring their motorcycles? What did the ad say? I'll answer the last. Yeah, to be loud. Fabulous. Yeah, because they're loud and we're trying to get rid of bad neighbors. Not all motorcycles are loud, fair enough. Great noise, yeah. We assume motorcycles are pretty loud, they're revving their engines, yeah, that now we have enough background knowledge to answer these questions specifically. And the ad was probably some kind of ad putting the neighbor's house up for sale, right? Place for rent, yeah, totally. Awesome, okay, we can go forward now.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so a little background knowledge arguably goes a bad way, a long way. And I love this quote, right? It is really hard to understand what we read if we know nothing about what we're reading. And language is a huge, huge piece of that. And go forward again. Okay, so arguably listening comprehension, we had the simple view and we're like, it's not really that simple, right? We need background knowledge, we need vocabulary, we also need updating as we read and try to understand, or even listen and try to understand. We're really putting together pieces of a puzzle, right? We're continually taking in more information and modifying what we're reading or listening to. And we know in children with DLD, that's much more difficult. So listening comprehension, while it's half of the simple view of reading, is not that simple. And tonight, I hope we can really demonstrate and build a case that the piece of reading that involves language, and arguably reading is language, it's written language, is incredibly important and complex, and that we really need to be supporting all children in terms of language. Awesome. Okay.
Point number 2.
This is my, gonna go ahead for a second?
Yep, can do.
Okay, perfect. Language is not one single construct. And I don't know if we have any other speech language pathologists in the room, but this is sort of how we conceptualize. This is sort of the big picture of how we think about language. So Language includes phonology. Those are the sounds that make up words. I might have said this backwards. And we know that phonology is absolutely crucial for word reading, right? And most children with dyslexia, the underlying difficulty is in their phonological system, as words map to, or sounds map to written words. Language also involves pragmatics, or how we use language and what context we use language. It involves grammar, sentence structure, how words are arranged in sentences, and semantics, vocabulary knowledge, knowledge of meaning.
Okay,
Yeah, you can click a couple times.
yeah.
Awesome. So we know that the primary aspect of language that supports word reading is our phonological system. I bet many people here are probably familiar with the definition of dyslexia, word reading difficulty that's most commonly caused by difficulty in the phonological system. And we know that listening comprehension is supported by grammar, semantics, and pragmatics, other components of oral language. So arguably, this is all language, right? Reading is language. It's written language. Writing is language, right? It's written language. I would guess that many people here are also familiar with Scarborough's rope model. And this is the early 2000s. Hollis Scarborough developed this, and it's absolutely just a beautiful depiction of the simple view of reading made a little less simple. And you can see what happens when in skilled reading, we have this really intertwined, strong rope, right? If you want to hold something heavy up, you need a rope that has many different strands woven together. Any one of these strands doesn't really hold much up. And the top of this diagram maps, I don't know if you can actually see my cursor. Shaun, can you see my cursor on the screen?
No, it's just
Like
my
so.
cursor. But
Oh, I can see your cursor.
yes,
Oh, that's funny. Okay, well, maybe for the audience, that's not useful. So thinking back to the simple view of reading, right? The half of the simple view of reading that is listening comprehension is really the top half of Hollis Scarborough's rope. Background knowledge, vocabulary, what we just talked about, what you needed to understand the passage about laundry, to understand where exactly Sally put those gophers, right? And this top half of the rope is what we're really honing in on when we're working with children with DLD. When language is difficult, we see that all these strands of the rope are often very difficult. In the case of dyslexia, we often have difficulty with the bottom half of the rope here. But very clearly, both halves are needed to intertwine and support skilled reading or reading comprehension. Awesome. We also, do you want to chime in? We're just going to chime in when we want to say something. Do you want to go ahead?
Usually covered that, but yeah, keep going.
Cool. We also know that reading comprehension, right, our end goal, changes a bit over time, right? So, and we know that in young children, each half of the simple view predicts later performance. So we know that early skills in terms of word reading, letter recognition, phoneme awareness predict accurate word reading by the time kids are in 3rd grade. And we also know that language, listening comprehension, our oral language system predicts comprehension, reading comprehension in 3rd grade. You can go ahead. We also know that in really young children, and I've been more and more sort of definitive in I'm not completely sure we can really measure reading comprehension in, say, beginning readers in kindergarten and 1st grade. Now, that's not entirely true. It's a little bit of hyperbole. But in beginning readers, and this is my favorite phonics reader, by the way, if anyone's curious, Gum on a Cat is just absolutely fantastic, and quite literally, it's about gum on a cat. So in a 1st grader who can decode, right, they're just plugging along, doing a great job with some short vowel words, closed syllables, sounding out gum on a cat, and they're getting a little more fluent. I would argue that reading comprehension is nearly all just reading the words accurately. In a first grader, even if their language skills are not a strength, and maybe even if they have DLD, someone loves, yep, Gum on a Cat. It's just great. First book both of my kids read. They're going to kind of understand that gum got on the cat, even if their oral language system is not super strong. It's not much linguistic load. Listening comprehension has much less of a role in reading comprehension at that point in our early readers. If we want to tap into the oral language system and understand comprehension, we really can't do it with what they can read. And we'll make a case later when we talk about working with kids with DLD, and I'll chime in on this, that we really want to make sure we're stimulating word recognition with books that kids can read and listening comprehension with books we read to them. We can move on. I think I have a, yeah. So when kids are older, and this is, I asked my 5th grader, I was like, what's a book you read recently that required some thinking? What I meant was reading comprehension, right? And he's like, Masterminds. I don't know, I haven't read it. But arguably, by the time word recognition is strong in upper elementary school, more of the variance in reading comprehension is attributed to listening comprehension, right? You really have to have a strong oral language system to figure out what this book was about. I heard it took quite a bit of focus and some background knowledge and vocab knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I tend to say, if someone comes to me and says, oh, she's having difficulty with reading, I say, I don't know, tell me more. So not all struggling readers are the same. And we're going to define struggling readers as kids who don't do well on a reading comprehension test or with reading comprehension, right? So they have difficulty with the end goal. If I just know that someone's struggling with reading, I really don't have much to say besides let's learn some more. Okay. We also know that in kids with overall strong skills, that word reading and listening comprehension are highly correlated, right? They both tend to be high. However, in kids with reading comprehension difficulty, we see that word reading and listening comprehension are less well correlated. That struggling readers, those with difficulty with reading comprehension, don't all struggle for the same reasons. So we're going to try to break that down a little bit and think about who is struggling and why. Okay. Shaun, you want to go through the quadrant or?
Yeah, I've got a whole
I've talked for a while. I should turn it over to you.
Great. I'm just happily listening. So it's probably worth orientating that this is the simple view of reading in a quadrant model.
Yes. So we're really, it's like we say things are, I just love the like, look, it's the simple view, and actually it gets a little more complicated and we can use it in a lot of different ways. And I also will throw in here, now that I'm like, here, I'll let Shaun talk for a second. I will say that this model is, I think it's incredibly useful for thinking about why a child might be struggling with reading comprehension. And this is based on the work of Hugh Katz and my mentor, Tiffany Hogan, and Suzanne Adloff, who's in South Carolina, and also Mark Fay, over starting in the early 2000s, but over really the last decade plus. So, Shaun, I'll let you go through.
I was going to say, well, and I was just going to say why it was informative for me, and I was saying this to Chris and Susan just before we started, is, 10 years ago, I've been working in the DLD space, or what was specific language impairment previous to that, for 15 years. And I would have argued till I was black and blue in the face that, dyslexia is an exclusionary criteria. You can't have dyslexia intersecting with, DLD, that DLD would sort of subsume all of the kids that, I was seeing with language and literacy. And a big part of the shift for me is this work by Hugh Katz and Suzanne and Tiffany and others, is to really sort of position what do we know about readers and also what services they need to be able to access. So if children have good listening comprehension and good word recognition, then we say that there's no difficulties. They've got these, at these skills that enable them to learn to read. Now, that gets a little confusing when sometimes we talk about instructional casualties. So when we're talking about these sort of this modeling, we're saying, children who've received adequate literacy instruction to be able to learn how to read. Those children who have good listening comprehension, but really still struggling with word recognition, we'd give those children the label of dyslexia, because the breakdown is really, as Kate said, in that sort of phonological system. We're trying to work out, how do we map this sound and letter system together into language? You know, how does it all kind of come together? If you've got difficulties in language comprehension or listening comprehension only, we would call this developmental language disorder. Now, I will be honest and say most of my caseload when it comes to developmental language disorder, most of them will have co-occurring reading difficulties. I don't know about you, Kate. Do you have many kids without oral, reading difficulties?
Yeah, I would say over the years, no, and we know.
I've had a couple, but not many.
A handful. And we know that across studies, and this has been established since, this quadrant model, which is originally based on a scatter plot, which doesn't look as tidy when you see it as a scatter plot. Like there's a lot of like gray area in the middle, and every kid is an individual, which we'll get to in a little bit. But we know actually that 50 to maybe 80% of children have difficulty in both word reading and language. So
this is more what you might see generally, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So more often than not, children would meet the criteria for dyslexia and developmental language disorder. In my experience, dyslexia tends to be more of a gateway diagnosis. Often the dyslexia might be identified prior to the developmental language disorder. However, there's a lot of shift in movement around the world where oral language difficulties we're hoping will be identified first. So you might see over the next few years that DLD might be diagnosed first, in which case I'm saying to all the speech language pathologists, don't forget about literacy, because it wasn't until I started my PhD research that I even found these children in the research, because in my classrooms and in the kids I work with, most of them would meet the criteria for dyslexia and DLD. Yeah.
And also we get this phenomenon, and I think in the US we absolutely see this, and I'm not sure we have numbers to put to this, but we have this idea of late emerging poor readers. So they look okay and they're sounding out words and they're plugging along and they understand gum on a cat. And then in 4th, 5th grade, when academic demands increase, and by academic demands, we often really mean language demands.
Language demands.
Right?
Yeah.
Like I wonder if those are synonymous in a way. When the linguistic complexity of text and just the linguistic complexity in the classroom increases, we see, all of a sudden, we have a lot of kids who aren't comprehending what they read. And this, they didn't suddenly develop an area of difficulty. They perhaps had language difficulty all along. We also have kids who we notice right away, fortunately, and in the US, there's been a lot of traction and we have plenty of room for growth, but we see that we do identify kids early, sometimes with word reading difficulty. And we don't notice that there's also language difficulty later. So most US states, and this audience certainly knows this the best, I would think, most US states, and I love IDA's graphic where you can hover over and see which states have dyslexia legislation. In most states, we do mandate dyslexia screening, but we don't mandate oral language screening. So we are doing, I would say, a much better job looking and finding difficulty early, which is absolutely fantastic in the area of word reading. But in language, we often don't notice that there's difficulty, especially if it's a bit less severe, until demands increase.
Start to use words like evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and all of a sudden it seems like their reading was going okay, but now they're really not understanding. So
exactly.
Should I jump in to talk about DLD then, Kate?
Yeah,
we've talked
perfect.
about it. We've used the acronym so much, and we thought it would be really helpful to talk about how reading might look. But now you're probably wondering, if you aren't familiar with DLD, what actually is it, and what does it look like? So we thought we'd step you through that.
And I want to give a shout out to Chris. Chris is fabulous in the chat. I am very impressed because Chris in real time is giving resources that we've sort of half shouted out. So the interactive map is in there too, where you can actually see which US states Oh, is there such thing as an oral language screener? I'm gonna address that when we talk about supporting kids with DLD, and you might too.
Yeah, perfect.
So yeah, gonna just
So
acknowledge that is, I'm really glad you asked. Yeah.
it's a great question. So when we think about working with children, I often talk about the fact that it's really important to actually put ourselves in the seat of the child that we're working with, and trying to really take on board their perspective. And sometimes with language can be really hard because I'm imagining that for many of you listening in, you've got fully formed oral language systems, you've got an adult brain and trying to comprehend childlike experiences. So I'm going to ask you a little question, a little activity, if you will. And my question is, a farmer has 30 cows and 28 chickens. How many didn't? It's a pretty simple question. I might give you a repetition, and please feel free to pop the answer in the chat box if you would, if you know the answer. I'll ask it, give you a repetition, because often in classrooms we'll give a repetition, right? When somebody doesn't comprehend. So a farmer has 30 cows and 28 chickens. How many didn't? Does anybody know the answer? So I've given you one level of scaffolding already. Didn't what? But we've got a bit of confusion. Yeah, it's a bit confusing, right? So a farmer had 30 cows and 28 chickens. How many didn't? I'm going to add a visual support this time and see if that aids your comprehension. So a farmer had 30 cows and 28 chickens. How many didn't? Does anybody know the answer now? Ten. That's right.
Very good.
It's a bit weird because since when were, cows carnivores? And a little homophone has sort of tricked us up. But the idea here is to not, is to give you an understanding of what is it like for the 7% of children sitting in classrooms right now who every time a classroom teacher gives them an instruction, they have that moment of confusion that you just had, where you're like, I know he's talking English. I know that they are words that I understand, but it doesn't make sense. So every time, it made perfect sense to me because I knew what was coming and I had the prior knowledge. I had the vocabulary. But because it was new for you, it wasn't really easy to understand. And really what we've done is then provided different opportunities for scaffolding with repetitions and visual supports, and that aided your comprehension. So this is the lived experience of children every single day around the country and around the world who struggle with oral language skills. Now, Kate's done a beautiful job of talking about language development, but what I really wanted to identify is that language is actually a primary skill. So children's brains are primed to learn language. Literacy is actually a secondary skill, or what I call a recycling of neurological pathways. We do not have a reading part of the brain. We reutilize the occipital lobe for visual information. We recycle the language system in the left hemisphere, most often in the left hemisphere of the brain. We recycle skills that we use for executive function, that we apply for planning and organizing ourselves. We utilize all of these to create literacy skills. Most children, so 93% of children, will actually learn language by osmosis. It just kind of happens because they're immersed in it. They use language for so many different skills, whether it's to express themselves or ask questions. Their language is so important for building relationships and telling stories, or even solving problems. You might be thinking about what you're doing after tonight's webinar by using the language skills to create a mental to-do list of what you need to do tonight or tomorrow. So we've got these amazing skills that we use all the time, so often so that we kind of take it for granted that everybody has the same sort of language skills that we do. And language can really take lots of different forms. And if you were to break down classroom instruction into input and output, I would argue that most of learning and assessment takes place through hearing something and reading something, and then being able to demonstrate our knowledge through talking and writing, our two outputs. Now, all of that must come through the language system. in order to be able to comprehend and unpack, as well as to pull it together and package it to demonstrate knowledge and understanding to somebody else. So language is absolutely critical for successful classroom or succeeding in the classroom. And as I've already said, we use it to sort of internalize our thoughts and externalize, our thoughts through, thinking to ourselves or talking to friends. So language is really important. In fact, we ran a campaign at RADLD, which is the International Body for Developmental Language Disorder Awareness. It's called Raising Awareness of DLD, and I'm very fortunate to be on the board there. We ran a campaign called Think Language, Think DLD, because when we canvassed, we found that most teachers were thinking about things like attention or executive functioning, but actually language is so very close to the core, or in my opinion, the core of learning and teaching within schools, that we often don't think about it as much as we probably should. So I've used lots of different analogies, like language is all around us. Information comes in and information goes out. So understanding as the information comes in and talking as the information goes out. And children will have difficulties with one or both of these pathways for no known reason. And that's what we call developmental language disorder. It's a neurodevelopmental condition that causes a breakdown in our ability to take on board that information and pass it to somebody else. I use an example when talking to my family. I come from, a good, solid working class family. And, I talk about the fact that language is a bit like a present. Our ability to wrap it all up is, our expressive or talking language, being able to take something from our brain and pass it to somebody else. And our receptive language or understanding is our ability to unwrap that. And for children with DLD, rather than it being maybe beautifully wrapped in all of the, shiny, sparkly Christmas paper that we're all using at the moment, or tinsel and ribbons, it's a bit like bunging words in a paper bag and tossing it to somebody else, because it's that bit harder. It's not so neat and clean as maybe the beautiful oration that their peers are using in the classroom. So it may look and sound different. And it's important to note that children with DLD do talk. It's not that they're not talking. It's that their ability to understand and use language is not at the level we would expect for their age. So that creates difficulties with being able to access things like learning in the classroom. Sometimes I will also talk about the fact that DLD is a neurodevelopmental disability. And so depending on the context, we might see differences between using terms like condition, disability. In schools, often we utilize the word disability because it attributes funding and recognition. So we need to use that term here in Australia, and in different states around the US, it would be similar, in terms of the terms that we use. So developmental language disorder has had a lot of problems. And in fact, until 2016, 2017, we had more than 40 different terms being used all around the world, which created significant issues for advocacy work, our practice within clinical settings and in schools, as well as research. So you might be familiar with some of these other terms like language delay or specific language impairment, or maybe language learning impairment, as terms that were utilized in the past, or you might have heard in your setting. But a group of international experts got together and went, enough is enough. We really need to sort this out. And that's how the catalyzed consensus was formed. So what they developed was 2 papers that are freely available, one on consensus for identification of children with language difficulties and what we're going to call it. And that's where the term DLD came from. So we're really only sort of 5 or 6 years into a massive rebranding effort. And if any of you have worked in marketing or in organizations that are really, going through rebranding processes, we know it takes quite a bit of time to get everybody on board and utilizing that consistent terminology. So here in Australia, our national body, our speech pathology body, has endorsed the term DLD, whereas different countries around the world are at different points of endorsing this term as well. So one of the probably most shocking things around DLD is actually the prevalence. And we've got a number of large-scale studies now in the US, the UK, and more recently in Australia that shows that developmental language disorder impacts about 1 in 14 children, which when I go and talk to the media and I go and talk to politicians, this is the major stumbling block for them, because if it's so prevalent, why haven't I heard of it before? And if it's so prevalent and it impacts so many people, why aren't more people talking about it. And that's because it's an invisible condition. It's a hidden disability. There's no obvious soft tissue markers. There's nothing where I look at a person and go, I can see that they've got a hearing aid. I can see that they're using a wheelchair. I can see that they've got a visual impairment. There's nothing that automatically cues you in to say that there's something different about the way that they interact with the world around them. That creates a really big challenge. There's also not a single test, no blood test, no brain scan that will automatically give you a diagnosis. It's done through observation. I'm going to talk about the diagnostic process in just a moment. So one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life is to walk into schools and say, hey, you've got this group of children. There's 1 in 14, which for Australian classrooms is about 2 in every classroom. It's a hidden disability. They do talk, but they don't talk as well. It's probably impacting them at schools, but only speech language pathologists are the magic professionals that can diagnose it. So it's a bit of a tough sell sometimes to kind of come in and actually convince people that it's a problem. And it's often through identifying other challenges that we get to the root cause, which is more often than not their difficulties with oral language. Now, if you're interested in putting, this to the test, if you go to the radld.org or you simply Google DLD calculator, this is a plugin that I've built into our website that means that you can actually look at how many people within your population likely have DLD. And in many of the schools that I work in, when I put in their school population, there is never, ever as many people identified with DLD as there are likely to be based on pure data and research. Would that be the same experience with UK? Does I see you shaking your head?
Absolutely. And I usually cite on your slide, you have Tomlin's study, that's the late 90s. And we've seen it, there's an article by Hendricks and Tiffany Hogan and colleagues that's just a couple years old where we see the exact same thing again. And then we see this in children we've been following for the past 5 or so years with DLD in our school district, our district partners here in Massachusetts. We see the exact same thing, that if we get even close to 50% identification rates, that's high. So yeah, this has been persistently low identification across the US since this was really first measured by epidemiologists.
So what does this mean for people? So DLD is a lifelong condition. Children don't grow out of it. It will persist into adulthood. However, when I talk to my adult friends with DLD, they will say things like, I felt like my DLD was the worst at school, or I feel like I only had DLD at school because they've actually chosen jobs that can help them with managing the language load. So whilst it is lifelong, it can be quite impactful in the school years because the language load of schooling is very, very high. It's very common that parents will say to me, they don't really have difficulties at home, but they really have difficulties at school. And that's often because home language and school language is different. And parents are actually very good at starting to adjust their language for their children at home to make it as accessible for them as possible. We know that language is really critical for learning. My entire PhD focuses on the impact of students with DLD at school in accessing the curriculum. So I could quite literally talk about this topic all day. But I just wanted to highlight that I have an open access systematic review that shows that children with DLD struggle in all areas of the curriculum. And then what I've got is another paper that's hopefully about to be published at the very start of next year that shows not only the fact that these students have difficulties, but what are the evidence-based supports that we can actually utilize. And it was things like we've used already, like providing additional time, providing visual supports. And when we've actually mapped these supports, more than 90% of them are supports that teachers are already using in classrooms for other children with disabilities, not just those with DLD, which I think is just saying we don't want you to do anything different. We just want you to use it with these particular group of children. The other thing to consider is that having difficulties with language comprehension is going to impact on social communication. Children with DLD present with different social language profiles to autistic children. So children with DLD often are seeking out social interactions. They want friends. They're very, very poor at maintaining friendships and exiting friendships appropriately. So they tend to be as pro-social as typical language users. but really struggle with that social communication. In fact, I think all of the children I've worked with this year have had some sort of social communication goal if they're sort of 10 and over, because they find that that is an area that they would prefer to work on than something like putting a grammatically correct sentence together. You know, that's a bigger priority for them. Yeah, same, Kate, similar.
Yeah, Shaun, I was just thinking, like, we often think about that juncture of sort of upper elementary, and there's been so much in terms of discussion of learning to read, to reading to learn, and the academic demands increase, but also the social demands. I think this piece is huge, and you know, conversation moves quickly. Kids start making more complex jokes, language becomes more subtle, and our kids with DLD really start needing support because it's valuable to them. This is crucial. Friendship is everything by the time kids are that age. And these are kids who want to be social and connected, but language moves fast and language goes away, and getting in and out of conversation is so hard. So I really don't think that piece can be overstated.
We can't accentuate enough that social communication is going to be impacted, but different to the autistic children that you might also be thinking of. You know, it's a different level of social need. The challenge that we found in our research is when we look at schools, social communication was the lowest priority, which was a real shame to see, and something we need to highlight for future work is making sure we support children with their social emotional well-being and their social communication. Which links in really nicely to say that students with DLD can actually behave differently to their peers. Often I'll walk into a school and I can almost sense the children with DLD in the space now, because they tend to be the ones that will sit at the back, withdraw from the classroom environment. They might be in the library because they don't really want to go out and interact during playtime. Or on the flip side, they could present with behaviors that really challenge us because their cognitive skills are actually within the average range. You know, they actually have reasonable awareness of the fact that they're struggling with these skills, but don't have the oral language in order to manage it well. And it kind of makes sense to me why children with DLD would demonstrate behavior that would challenge me, because I too would feel frustrated if every time I heard an instruction in the classroom, it sounded like cows eating chickens and I didn't know what it meant. DLD often co-occurs with other conditions, and I've got another slide on this later to say that, you know, it often intersects with ADHD and developmental coordination disorder, what we used to call dysgraphia. No, not dysgraphia. My goodness, I'm losing my words now. What's the word I'm looking for, Kate?
It's contagious.
Dyspraxia
as well. Dyspraxia. Thank you.
Yeah.
Movement difficulty.
It often frequently occurs with dyslexia, as we've talked about, behavior difficulties and social emotional needs. But one of the biggest challenges is that most people haven't heard of it. In fact, there was a study done in Australia in 2022 that found that less than 20% of the population had even heard of DLD. And I actually think that was really conservative. Like, I was expecting to be somewhere between like 5 and 7% of the population had heard of it. So we've got a long way to go. And in comparison, more than 90% of the population have heard of dyslexia. They've heard of autism. They've heard of ADHD. So we've got a really long way to go to ensure that people know about DLD and understand the impacts of it. Now, just for a little bit of information, how do we go about diagnosing? I already mentioned we don't have sort of a blood test or a brain scan. Speech pathologists are trained to diagnose DLD, and we do that through observation. So we will do things like standardized assessments where we'll measure their oral language skills. We might do it through non-standardized measures where we get them to tell us a story or the rules of a game or something about a sport they play. We love talking to teachers to get that understanding of the impact at school and looking at report cards and work samples, because there's three main criteria, and there's difficulties with oral language, and we can do that through our testing. But what we can't get through a standardized test is, how does it impact them every single day? And that's where families and teachers are absolutely our critical partners in ensuring that we have the information to make an informed diagnosis. What we also can sometimes grapple with is, do we think that this is likely to be lifelong? Now, if a child is under the age of 5, sometimes it can be a bit tricky because oral language development is not a straight line. It can go up and down a bit. But once a child enters school, we have really good longitudinal studies that suggest that language is unlikely to shift significantly after they enter school. So we're not going to get a sudden burst once they enter school. So if they're 5 and over, and definitely 7 and over, it's likely if they're struggling with oral language, it's likely to impact them throughout the remainder of their life.
And I'll also
Um,
add, there is such thing as a late talker. And that's been a lot of the confusion where in our very, very young children, our
Mm.
sort of 18-month to 2-year-olds, where we're not having them string together a few words, or 2-year-olds are not really communicating verbally, there is such thing as late talkers who may benefit from some course of speech language pathology support, who do not go on to have developmental language disorder. So this sort of confuses the issue further, right? But like Shaun said, we do know that by the time kids are kindergarten, sort of school age, if oral language is difficult, it's quite likely to be developmental language disorder.
So I've kind of already said people with DLD will have average, whether it's low average or even to above average cognitive skills. So they've got IQs within the average range. However, language is the main area of difficulty. It impacts all languages spoken. So being bilingual or multilingual doesn't cause DLD. And we've got really solid evidence to suggest that is the case. We also know that parents and caregivers do not cause DLD. It's not through a lack of communication that causes DLD. However, we do know that parents and caregivers are critical in terms of the support for children with DLD. And we don't have a specific cause for DLD. The genetics for language development are really unclear. So there's not a single gene that turns on and off language acquisition. There's hundreds of thousands of genes. So in my lifetime, it's probably unlikely we'll get to the point of really saying it's this gene or this gene that's being impacted, because hundreds of thousands of genes are switched on and off to develop the language part of the brain. So we have no known specific cause for DLD. If there's a condition like autism or intellectual disability or cerebral palsy, we don't use the term DLD. We'd say language disorder. So we drop the D when we, I say we add the D when we don't know the cause. And I don't think I have it in this slide, but normally I have a bit of an overlapping circles. If you think about 10% of the population having difficulties with oral language, we're saying about 7 to 7.5% will have DLD, and 2 to 2.5% will have those other conditions like autism and intellectual disability, which in my experience is not represented in the way I work in schools. Often those children will be more immediately recognized, getting obvious supports. And so I wouldn't say that 3/4 of my communication supports in schools were going to kids with DLD, despite the suggestion that from strong research that would be the case. And I've already just said what my next point was. So I've talked about this a little bit already, but there's 3 criteria. We know that there's difficulties in oral language that impacts them every day, and the cause is unknown, and that it impacts a person lifelong. What we want to also investigate is any other languages spoken. We can't really diagnose DLD until we've investigated all languages spoken, particularly for bilingual and multilingual speakers, because it might be that they're still learning the local language. However, children are amazing. And in fact, I've had an experience recently of a child who came to Australia who hadn't spoken English before. By the end of their first school year, they were already utilizing English to learn in the classroom. So, you know, the brain is primed to learn language, and it's an amazing thing. These children will have obvious difficulties with oral language, and we want to know, is there a cause, in which case we call it language disorder, or if the cause is unknown, we call it DLD. I just wanted to highlight that obviously children with DLD will struggle at school because of that difficulty with oral language, and it impacts people's communication, but also education and employment. The biggest thing that I do highlight, as I've already talked about, is that people with DLD are vulnerable to mental health needs. And the main interventions we use for supporting mental health are talking-based therapies. So if you think of sort of that classic image of psychology services, it's always somebody talking to somebody about the challenges that they face or their experiences. However, if you don't have the oral language skills of your peers, engaging in talking-based therapies is really hard. So a lot of work I do is with my psychology colleagues on how do we adapt talking-based therapies for those most vulnerable, but in a way that they can actually understand. As I've already said, students with DLD struggle with academic achievement in all areas, and the level of awareness is really low. And despite the fact that they're at high risk, there isn't actually a lot of information out there to help teachers, because I've looked for it. I've gone and trawled everywhere. So what teachers are actually in a really vulnerable position where they don't have a lot of information, which is why the product of my PhD research is producing a guideline that's freely available for teachers with online training to say, here are the challenges and how do we provide the best quality support. And I think that that is a very practical but very positive outcome from a body of research. I feel like we've already talked about this, Kate, but I love a good Pamela Snow visual, and many of you who've attended previous IDA workshops might be familiar with Pam Snow, who will claim she's an Australian psychologist and speech pathologist, and she developed this model called the Language House, where the base of our learning at school is really on the solid ground of good social emotional learning, and then the floor of our house is good oral language experiences. Without these, we can't develop the reading, writing, and spelling skills and the positive pro-social and interpersonal skills that the learning that we actually measure, which is academic achievement and accessing the curriculum, is guided by. So we often focus on academic achievement, or are they employable? Are they transitioning to further training after school or engaging in trade apprenticeships? But really what underpins all of that is these, what sometimes are considered softer skills, but absolutely critical, which is their oral language foundation and our ability to teach these skills of reading, writing, and spelling alongside teaching them to have resilience, to have the social language they need to interact with the world around them. So just another beautiful model that we've pinched from somebody else that Kate and I both love. Kate, I'm going to hand over you to talk about how does DLD fit within our education context within the US?
Awesome. Perfect. So I really want to contextualize this because it has been so massively confusing, which Shaun got to. And Shaun, actually, we just in the chat, I love the chat here, and Chris is just like on top of it with resources. So, and we will share the slides after. But I just want to give some context because Shaun got to this, right? It was only 2017. It wasn't that long ago. The consensus was achieved that we'll use the term DLD. So I often tell this, and this slide is actually credit to Tiffany Hogan, who tells us a bit as a story, right? So we often have children, this is a common story in the United States. We often have children whose parents will come to us and say, my child has 3 different conditions. They have developmental delay, they have a communication impairment, and they have specific learning disability. I'm like, huh, that's really interesting. Well, where does DLD fit here? I would say this is all DLD, right? So we use labels in the United States under special education law, that's IDEA, to qualify children for services. We have to do that. I would be hard pressed to think that federal special education law is going to change massively anytime soon. In most states, there are 11 qualifying categories, including developmental delay, communication impairment, and specific learning disability. We tend to see, and I can actually give a paper on this at the end, my lovely colleague Wendy Gorgon did a paper about how labels tend to shift, that when children are younger, they qualify for speech and language services if we find them at all under developmental delay. Then that label often shifts to speech language impairment, and often in upper elementary school, it shifts, or the qualifying category shifts to specific learning disability. Whereas we would argue for advocacy purposes, clarity, empowerment, interprofessional collaboration, this is all DLD. So what we're really doing now, and Shaun, you can advance the slide, is really trying to come together to use the term DLD on IEPs, regardless of the other categories we have to use because it's the law. So I'd love to see more IEPs where the child has language difficulty, where it says, I'm getting my colleagues waving at me. I have colleagues waving at me outside the window of lab here. I'm here very late at night. Where we actually see the term DLD regardless of the category we have to use, because the law is a bit of the law. We also know that in the case of DLD, language is like a train leaving the station late. We see that kids follow the same trajectory and the same sequence of language acquisition. They just never quite catch up. This is lifelong and persistent.
And Kate, can I just add that this isn't a problem just in the States, it's also a problem in Australia. And one of the pieces of work that we've been doing is, so we have 6 funding categories in the state that I live in. And the work that I've been doing with speech pathologists is actually, traditionally what we do is we look at the 6 categories and try and work out how we can slot kids into them. And what we've actually started doing is focusing on diagnosis, because our federal law actually has changed in the last 5 years. And so now we have to recognize all learning needs, whether or not they do or don't fit into funding categories. And so what we do now is focus on the diagnosis and the needs of the individual child. And in some instances, children with DLD do fit into our funding categories, and sometimes they don't. But legislatively, we actually need to be providing adjustments whether they fit in neatly or not, because those buckets actually only relate to funding, not necessarily the legal requirement to make adjustments for all children. So that's actually been a really interesting project. I'd like to say it's been really successful, but it's actually been really hard. And I've learned a lot, and we need to sort of take those learnings and reapply them in different ways. So, you know, it sometimes is about saying whether or not they fit into the perfect category, this is what it is. And I think you'll see that shift as more speech pathologists are diagnosing and therefore needing to identify the supports for these young people. I think the point of this slide, correct me if I'm wrong, Kate, was just to direct people to further information around DLD on the DLD project on website,
So
and
huge shout out
DLD.org.
to Shaun, DLD project is Shaun, and then for a more of a US context, including some information about why terminology varies and different labels and qualification categories as compared to diagnosis, you can go to dld.org.
Yeah, and I should have added, I'm remiss, I should have added radld.org. So Chris, if you're listening.
I put in the chat earlier.
Oh, good, thank you.
We've been loading up the chat with resources.
I love it, and Chris is going to share this after the workshop. I just wanted to highlight that there are lots of co-occurring conditions, as I've already talked about, and I don't have time to go into all of them, but Kate's already beautifully used my examples. So I'm just going to reiterate with this beautiful picture of James, who's not a real child. Sorry, this isn't really James, but is a real child who I worked with, and his mother came in and said, you know, he's got a diagnosis of ADHD, he's got a diagnosis of dyslexia, he's got a diagnosis of auditory processing disorder. One came from the PED, one came from the educational psych, one came from the audiologist, and then you're giving him a diagnosis of DLD. Which one is the ultimate truth? And I was like, well, they're all true, but the root of the cause is often the oral language, you know. So we're going to say, you know, these all intersect, but DLD is this part of the picture. And some of you might be familiar with the Indian proverb of the blind man feeling the elephant. You know, we all will only see things from our perspectives, and that includes parents and caregivers. You know, I often think as a speech pathologist, I'm somewhere at the head end. You know, the audiologist might be somewhere at the ear. I don't know, the physiotherapist can be right down the back end because they deal with things like, you know, toileting with the OTs. But, you know, we only have our skills and ability to observe from our training, our viewpoint, which is why it's really important that we see children as a whole person. So I know that DLD is a part of who they are, but ultimately they're their own individual whole person, and I need to see them as such. And often children with DLD will have multidisciplinary needs where they need a speech pathologist and an OT, maybe a physio, alongside the teacher and the parents and caregivers, so that we have a truly holistic view of the child. So that was the point that I wanted to identify there. And you've already talked about this, that there's that co-occurrence between DLD and dyslexia, and that in some instances, you know, not every two children are exactly the same, are they, Kate? Some dials will be switched up on sound deck, some will be switched down.
When I talk to parents, you can continue, but in terms of from the parent perspective, just really keeping in mind that at the very least, advocating to make sure that all of these areas have been assessed and that a team is coming together to support the child. That it is a rare case where I think we can assess either word reading or oral language and not both, and where we can not dig into other skills. I heard the webinars in the chat. Chris said we're actually literally turning off at 8:30, but I think we can go 5 more minutes and then take questions for 10.
No worries. I think, Kate, you've covered this advocacy bit already. Did you just want to talk through these quick points and I'll jump into some strategies?
Yeah, and if you go to DLD and me, you can go through this, but we know that we have research terminology, clinical terminology, and educational terminology, and it is not all the same. So we also know, if you keep clicking through, that we've made incredible progress very recently to make DLD a household name. So DLD is not a household name. However, the results, despite being very common, language is difficult to explain, everything Shaun has said. Language difficulties can be concealed when routines are familiar. When a child's in the home, we might not see this until a child goes to school. And academic demands, which really are often language demands, increase and become more complex. And we have late talkers who don't always go on to have DLD. So, and many, many names. So we're not all always, we're all talking about the same thing, but using different terms, which is massively confusing. We also know, and this is such a huge issue, I put the QR code in, but feel free to pull up this article, but we also know that DLD needs to be a household name because of the long-term negative impacts. When we don't support children who have difficulty with language, we know, unfortunately, that all of these downstream negative effects can occur. In terms of recent advocacy work, and this came up in the chat, and I love this. I was like, oh, you set me up for this. So yes, DLD is now in the DSM 5th edition. It's in the 11th edition of the World Health Organization's ICD. And very recently, and I think I put a link to this, but I'll put it in the chat at the end if not, the Department of Education federally gave guidance that we can use the term DLD when qualifying a child for services, just like we can say dyslexia. So on an IEP, we don't have to say specific learning disability in language or speech language impairment. We can write the term, we have to say those because they're the qualifying categories, but we can put the term DLD right on there, just like we can say dyslexia instead of specific learning disability in reading, which is huge. Science of Reading Defining Guide is from the Reading League. And if you Google this, it'll come right up. But they have included DLD in this and oral language, which is also huge progress. So we see one of the largest national organizations, I would say outside of the International Dyslexia Association, putting oral language and DLD right at the forefront of their work. If you're interested in hearing more about Tiffany Hogan and Kelly Farquharson and Carla McGregor's efforts in the US to get the term DLD into the forefront of discussion in terms of special education and how we talk about difficulties and how children qualify for services, I would highly recommend this recent podcast. And this is just the same. I added the QR code so you can link right out to this. And this is not the podcast, this is an article that you can read that explains how we can use the term DLD. And this is just like, and I love this, it references the Dear Colleague letter that many of you probably know about and says it's the same with DLD. So huge news. This is just in the past few months.
And I just wanted to add, if you are talking about DLD in your school context, we actually have some free resources on the DLD project website. This is our checklist for advocating for your child at school, acknowledging that if you are the parent of a child with DLD or any neurodevelopmental condition, it's actually often a repetitive and tiring task. And often there'll be ebbs and flows across schooling. You know, starting school is a high, and then middle of primary school or elementary schooling is low, and then transitioning to middle, transitioning to high can be, you know, high school can be challenging. So this is just a checklist and reminds parents of what their rights are. And it's broad enough that it's not Australian legislative specific. So I'm just going to quickly run through, because I do want to make sure we have time for questions. So there are some strategies we can use for kids with DLD. My main point, if I was to say take anything away about helping children with DLD, is language is very fleeting and we want to make it as tactile and visible as possible. So if you can make it written or a really bad drawing like mine, I carry a whiteboard and a whiteboard marker with me everywhere. And I'm always thinking about how can I make this fleeting thing called language something that we can interact with. And often it comes through with things like experiments or modeling and showing them how to do something. So we can actually make it something they can touch and see more, are they more likely to be able to utilize it. So some strategies around giving instructions. You can access these after the workshop around chunking information, particularly giving them time to process and respond. That's coming through a lot in my research, is additional time is really important, but there's a sweet spot. Too much time makes them feel silly, too little time makes them feel rushed, and it seems to be quite individualized. I also would say that getting them to learn to ask for repetitions and clarifications is their first step into self-advocacy, but it looks different for different children. We want to make we want to explicitly teach concepts. We don't have great research on pedagogy, the way in which we teach children in DLD yet. My interpretation of lots and lots of years of teaching is the more explicit we can make it, the better. And they're going to need time to learn new vocabulary, as we've already talked about. We can do things like have word banks and word walls, and we can do this on our fridge at home as parents and caregivers. We can get them to have little personal dictionaries where we add new words, because I don't know about you, but the dictionaries that my kids get at school are not particularly helpful because we need the dictionary to read the dictionary. So we kind of create our own definition. Yeah.
Definitions often have words that are more complex than the word.
So it's like, actually, how do we say it in our own word, our own way, and then use words in lots of different ways to show them that words can actually be used in different contexts. It probably would come as no surprise that actually working on literacy helps build language. And in fact, we have this positive feedback loop. The more we can read, the better we can develop those oral language skills, because there's language that is locked away in Shakespearean sonnets or textbooks and all of these wonderful, literary, points of reference that we can't access if we can't read them. And you and I don't talk like that. We talk in conversational language. So to be able to access that language is really important. And we can recast what they've said to give them a model as to what it looks like, and extend what they've said by using things like adjectives and joining words to help them show that there's more complex ways of saying things. And often getting them to think before they speak, getting them to draw something or plan for something before they undertake a written or verbal task can be really helpful for formulating their thoughts. Some just quick tips for home would be considering the language we use at home and pairing, as I've said, information with written information or visual supports. Try and reduce the cognitive load and chunk it down to specific tasks. Often words like before and after are super confusing, so I don't use those so much anymore. Often I'll say, give them one piece of information and then the next piece of information. And when it comes time to talking to school, we want adjustments not just for learning, but also for assessment. So it's one thing to adjust the way we learn, but actually, do they need more time, or do they need a scribe, or do they need something else to help them be successful with assessment? And to build that partnership with school, which is that advocacy piece that we were just talking about earlier. Here's some strategies on our website to say, how can you do that and build a positive working relationship with school? Because that's often really hard, especially when the school doesn't really know much about DLD and you feel like you're the one that's educating them. And as we've said probably 20 times already, but we'll reiterate one more time, Kate, is we want to support their mental health and make sure that they're going okay. It's going to be really hard to struggle at school, particularly when oral language doesn't come naturally to them. These are just some points for older children, sort of upper elementary, middle and high school. We want to focus on academic support, but making information accessible. A lot of what I do in high school is actually making assessment more accessible, more white space, breaking down words, making sure they understand, getting them letters for support for their internal, external exams, and then teaching them to use technology, even things like their smartphone or Outlook. Any of those things can be really, really helpful for them. Gosh, I was really on a bandwagon this week. Must have said support mental health 25,000 times.
I don't think it can be understated.
I don't think so. Yeah. Over to you, Kate.
These take-home points, I think we've set ourselves up for these take-home points, but oral language is essential. Literacy really is language. DLD is common, but we need more awareness, and we need to be identifying children with DLD. And we did, I put a free resource that my colleague Sue Bao led, the screener, it's open source, and to answer the earlier question, there are valid and reliable screeners for DLD, especially once children are around age 5. And we also gave a shout out to Shaun, your podcast with Trina Spencer and Doug Peterson, where you talk about cubed, and that was in the chat. And yes, that's a very helpful measure.
Yeah. I'm not sure if Kate wants me to do this now, but Kate has a really beautiful study open at the moment. We're not really plugging it because we've got lots of participants now, but there is a study that Kate is doing at the moment, which is around parents from kindergarten to grade 2 looking at providing information for families. So if you're interested, reach out to Kate in that, because, the more the merrier, Kate, I'm sure.
The more the merrier, and we're thrilled. And the reason we're doing this is because what we find is even when a child has DLD, because it may be more evident at school and less evident at home, parents aren't necessarily aware until the child starts having difficulty later on.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, I'm sorry, we've only got a few minutes left for questions, Susan
No,
and
that
Chris.
was
Thank
absolutely
you so much.
amazing, and thank you. As you can tell, this is like a very important and hot topic for many of us, you know, whether we're reading specialists or, you know, basically language and communication specialists. This is kind of our jam, kind of our thing. So we want to say thank you very, very much.
Wonderful, wonderful presentation. I learned a lot of new information. Thank you.
And that was honestly, I know I'm the one who mentioned Cubed because we had been using it for a while in my previous district, but so that list of screeners, is that just good general practice to do like an oral language screener, just like with our new updated legislation, we're doing dyslexia screeners. Is this just part and parcel?
I think
Okay.
that's the dream. I mean, Shaun can comment too, but if literacy is language and language is needed for literacy and we're screening for dyslexia and we need both sides of the simple view. So full circle to where we started, I would say we should screen systematically for both sides.
Yeah.
Makes good sense.
Absolutely.
It's
And
not happening. I see traction in that direction, but it's going to take a lot.
And part of the limitation is that some of the tools that we've had for the last 25 years have not been great because language changes so much. And if you said, can you describe how wide and how deep oral language is? Like, even if you just take English as a single language, it's so big. Like and it constantly changes, and you add words like Google, at a point, and all of a sudden, people need to learn new words, or words are used like Riz, I was learning about the other day from my preteen, didn't know what that word meant because I'd never encountered it before. So, it's all of a sudden words change. So screeners are great, and there are some limitations to that. So, and then some services don't have anywhere to send them after they've screened them. So we know that these are challenges. So,
and just like we've seen this with dyslexia, where screening is not useful if we gather the information and don't act on it.
Right.
And the same thing is the case with oral language. And I will say this is probably more complex than screening for dyslexia. It is less concrete and less cut and dry, like Shaun said. I do think so. A huge piece of it doesn't look like formal screening, but a huge piece of this is education and making sure teachers and all related professionals, that this can't fall on any one person, and that we need to collaborate so that many different professionals know what types of things to look for in classrooms. That could be red flags that tell us, oh, maybe you do want, if you're not screening all children, maybe you want to administer something like the narrative language measure of the cubed, or maybe you want to probe further, or maybe you want to consult with a speech language pathologist.
Great. Well, again, we can't thank you enough. This was wonderful. Just so we can let everyone know, give me about 7 days and we will upload this to our IDA-NNEA website. And then Shaun and Kate have graciously said they'll share the presentation with us. So that will be uploaded as well. So people should have access to that within a week. So again,
Kate and I just popped our email addresses in. Very happy to
connect.
Great. Thank you so much.
We love talking to people because it helps us. And I think because we are practitioners and researchers, it grounds everything we do in the reality of your own experiences. So thank you for coming and sharing.
Every question teaches me from a family, teaches me something.
We appreciate you so much. Happy holidays. And thank you so much. Zoom will truly, it shuts off right at 8:30. So we're like,
so dramatic.
so much. We really appreciate it. Thank you very, very much. And have a wonderful holiday season.
Thank you to all our guests that tuned in tonight.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great end of December. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.